know now, of course, that Chris Kaba was a core member, as he's been described as, of the 6-7 gang, which has also been described as a music collective, but we all now pretty aware that it's effectively a cover for an organised crime group. We know that in the weeks leading up to his shooting, that he'd been involved himself in armed criminality. Although, of course, up until yesterday, the public, just seen nice pictures of him smiling and looking like a nice kid. The irony, of course, is, people have said his life shouldn't have been taken, that no one had a right to have their life taken. But we now know that he ran through a packed dance floor and a nightclub, firing indiscriminately at a rival gang member. How no one else was hit, we don't know. Pursued the person out into the street and shot. So I think, for me, the most annoying thing is that this information is only coming out now. And I understand the legalities, I absolutely do. But there's something about the British psyche whereby we cannot speak ill of the dead. And people, who are actually the criminals are made to appear to be the victims, while good, honest, hard-working police officers doing their job are painted as the villains. And of course, in this case, it's resulted in an officer having to go through the indignity of a trial, which I think most people that sat in the trial think should never have happened, because there was simply no evidence to support it. So yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it. I just think it was wrong.
Shots fired!
There's far more to it than the indignity of a trial. It might be indignity, but there was also the risk, of course, that he might go to prison for life. So you've probably been talking 15 years imprisonment for a man doing his job. And of course it goes beyond that, it goes to his family. And speaking from personal experience, I did 25 years as a frontline armed officers, went out on many very dangerous operations. I found myself having to open fire on 3 separate occasions and stood trial for murder for one of them. And really, in all honesty, I stood trial for murder 10 years after the shooting incident and about 8 years after I'd retired. And it was only then that I kind of realised just how selfish I was as a young man, because while my wife initially, my partners, my children never showed any concern, I now know that they must have done. My son's a Royal Marine. He's served many times in Afghanistan, and it kind of took that. It kind of, when he was deployed, to make me realise what I was putting my own family through for 25 years. And I lived potentially with death threats from 1987 until today. Since 1987, I've had cameras and alarms on my house connected straight to armed response vehicles now. And unfortunately, that's the life that Martyn Blake is now, and his family are now going to have to live in. I've had death threats, although it was many years ago, but even to this day, I mean, within the last 8 or 9 months, someone's recognised me in a pub and sort of quite sinister overtones, saying, "You shot my schoolmate." So it is with you forever. The advantage that Martyn's got that I didn't have was that because he's a serving officer, fortunately his face isn't known, although anyone that saw him in court will obviously recognise him. But still, the fact is he'll almost certainly have to be protected for some considerable time, and his family. It's a huge strain. I can only speak for how I felt, and I might sound callous when I say this, but I've never lost any sleep over having to take human life. I don't think that there's anything wrong with me. It just happens to be, I think, that I can compartmentalise that aspect to it. I mean, some people get involved in a shooting, hadn't possibly thought it through, or thought that they had but hadn't, and find that it affects them much worse. I mean, it's a conversation I've had with my son. I mean, my son is, as I said, is a soldier, and he's had to take life, and we both kind of over a beer talked about it and said, well, why aren't we affected by it? And we both sort of come to the conclusion that we just have the ability to deal with it when some other people don't. But I mean, in the case of, I've said this several times, and this probably will make me sound very callous, but in the case of Azelle Rodney, I felt nothing when I was shooting him. As far as I was concerned, he posed a threat to my colleagues and he had to be shot. And it was only afterwards, because I was left at the scene watching my colleagues doing first aid on him, and then eventually the ambulance arrived and said, you know, he's dead, there's nothing we can do. And then I just sat there just looking at the crime scene. I had nothing else to look at, and I started to feel myself getting angry because I was about 100 days away from my retirement, and I knew that this selfish young man who, through greed, had gone out with firearms to rob rival drug dealers and kill them, had probably put my life on hold for a few years at least. As it turned out, it was 10 years, and the effects are still continuing to this day. Of course, a lot of people are thinking in advance now, do I really want to continue doing this? So that we know, I think the commissioner, the current commissioner has said that, I think it's something ridiculous like 25% of authorised firearms officers have handed in their authorisation already, and a tiny percentage of the numbers that we used to recruit into what is now MO19 is just reduced from the 300s down to about 6 last year. So that aside, there is going to be a problem of finding people to do the job. So I think I think you're absolutely right, there is a very real danger that someone might hesitate for a fraction of a second, and that is all it takes. You know, in any situation I've been involved, I haven't made the decision to pull the trigger until the very last second. And I think if I'd have delayed it any longer, either myself or one of my colleagues might not be, you know, still with us. So I think, yes, there is a very real danger of that. And I think the problem is, if we're not going to get the volunteers, if we haven't gotten sufficient numbers to volunteer for this role, what is going to happen is what the sort of liberal elite in this country that don't even like the idea of police officers having guns at all, is ironically they're going to be the ones responsible for us ending up with a fully armed police force. Because if you haven't got volunteers, then you have to make it a condition of service that every police officer carries a gun. And I don't think that's a route they've thought through, because that's where it'll end up.